The final notes of the last hymn faded away, leaving St. George's Chapel wrapped in a profound silence that seemed to honor both the man they had lost and the magnitude of their collective grief. Prince Philip's coffin began its slow journey out of the chapel, carried by pallbearers whose precision and dignity reflected the military traditions that had been so important to the Duke throughout his life. As the family filed out of their pews to follow the coffin, the careful choreography that had kept Harry and William separated began to break down naturally. The formal structure of the ceremony gave way to the more fluid movements of people processing grief in their own individual ways. It was in this moment of transition that Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, made a decision that would prove pivotal for both brothers. Rather than walking directly alongside her husband as protocol might have suggested, Catherine fell back slightly, creating space between herself and William. Her gesture was subtle but deliberate, and it had the effect of allowing Harry to move closer to his brother as they walked together behind their grandfather's coffin. The Duchess understood that sometimes diplomatic solutions required small acts of personal sacrifice, and she was willing to step aside if it meant giving the brothers a chance to reconnect. For several minutes, Harry and William walked in silence, the weight of the moment making conversation feel impossible. But as they moved through the chapel's ancient doorway and into the afternoon sunlight, something shifted between them. Perhaps it was the shared experience of honoring their grandfather's memory, or maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of all the unspoken words that had built up over months of separation. "He would have wanted us to walk together," William said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps on the stone path. Harry felt his heart skip at hearing his brother's voice directed toward him for the first time in over a year. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of acknowledgement of their shared history, their mutual loss, and, perhaps most importantly, their grandfather's hopes for their relationship. "He always did," Harry replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Even when we were being complete idiots." A ghost of a smile crossed William's face at the memory of their grandfather's patient but firm guidance during their more rebellious moments as young men. Prince Philip had never shied away from calling out behavior he found unacceptable, but he had always done so with an underlying foundation of love and support that made his corrections feel like guidance rather than criticism. As they continued walking, other family members seemed to sense the significance of the moment and instinctively provided them with space. Charles walked ahead with Princess and, while other relatives maintained respectful distances that allowed for private conversation without completely isolating the brothers from the group. "I've missed him," William said, and Harry understood that the words carried multiple meanings. William was speaking about their grandfather, but there was an undertone that suggested he might be acknowledging other losses as well. "So have I," Harry responded, "more than I can really put into words." The conversation that followed was halting and careful, both brothers testing the waters of communication that had been frozen for so long. They talked about their grandfather's influence on their lives, sharing memories that helped them reconnect with the bond they had once shared. William recalled how Prince Philip had taught them both to drive on the private roads around Balmoral, while Harry remembered their grandfather's attempts to explain the more archaic rules of cricket during long summer afternoons. As they reached the courtyard where family members would part ways, both brothers seemed reluctant to let the moment end. The funeral had provided them with a reason to be together, but once it concluded, the complicated realities of their separate lives would reassert themselves. Harry would return to California and his new family, while William would resume his duties as second in line to the throne. Catherine, who had been watching the interaction with careful attention, approached them with their cousin Peter Phillips, who had been seated between them during the service. There was an unspoken understanding among all three that this conversation between the brothers was important and needed to continue without the constraints of the formal funeral setting. "Why don't you both walk back together?" Catherine suggested gently. "I can ride with Peter." It was a simple offer, but it represented hours of additional time for Harry and William to continue their tentative reconnection. The walk back to Windsor Castle would take them along paths they had traveled countless times as children, through gardens where they had played and argued and laughed together. The familiar setting might help them rediscover the ease they had once shared. William hesitated for a moment, glancing at his wife with an expression of gratitude and uncertainty. He understood the significance of her offer and the trust she was placing in him to handle this delicate situation appropriately. Harry waited, trying not to let hope show too clearly on his face, while internally bracing himself for potential rejection. "I'd like that," William finally said, his words simple but carrying the weight of a decision that went far beyond a mere walk. As they began the journey back to the castle, walking side by side for the first time in over a year, both brothers felt the weight of everything that needed to be said and the challenge of finding words adequate to the task. The conversation that followed was not a complete reconciliation. Too much had happened for such a simple resolution. But it represented the first genuine communication they had shared since Harry's departure from royal duties. They talked about their children, with William sharing updates about George, Charlotte, and Louis, while Harry spoke about Archie's development and Meghan's pregnancy. These personal details, shared tentatively at first but, with growing warmth, helped remind them of their roles not just as princes, but as fathers who wanted their children to grow up knowing their cousins and extended family. The conversation also touched on more difficult topics, though both brothers seemed to understand that deep healing would require more time and privacy than this public moment could provide. William acknowledged the pressures that had contributed to Harry's decision to leave, while Harry expressed regret about some of the ways their family disputes had played out in public. Neither brother offered complete absolution, but both seemed willing to begin the difficult work of rebuilding trust. As they approached the castle where they would inevitably have to part ways again, both Harry and William seemed to understand that this moment, however significant, was just the beginning of a much longer process. The funeral had given them permission to start talking again, but the real work of reconciliation would happen in private conversations away from cameras and public scrutiny. Prince Philip, who had spent his final years hoping to see his grandsons reconciled, would have been pleased to know that his funeral had accomplished what months of family interventions and public statements had failed to achieve. The two brothers who had been inseparable as children and who had supported each other through their mother's death had taken the first tentative steps back toward each other, guided by their shared grief and the memory of a grandfather who had always believed that family bonds were stronger than any temporary disagreements. The path ahead remained uncertain, and both brothers understood that rebuilding their relationship would require patience, forgiveness, and compromise from both sides. But as they reached the castle and prepared to return to their separate lives, there was a sense that the conversation would continue, that the door to reconciliation had been opened, and that Prince Philip's greatest wish for his grandsons might eventually be fulfilled. The heavy wooden door opened with a soft creak, and Prince Harry stepped into the room where his family had gathered. The conversation that had been flowing moments before seemed to pause, creating a silence that felt deafening. Eyes turned toward him, some welcoming, others cautious, and a few deliberately averted. But the gaze he sought most belonged to his brother, who stood near the far window overlooking the castle grounds. Prince William's shoulders tensed visibly as he sensed Harry's presence before even turning around. When their eyes finally met across the room, the weight of everything unsaid hung between them like a physical barrier. Neither brother moved toward the other immediately. Instead, they exchanged the briefest of nods, a gesture so formal it would have been unthinkable between them just a few years earlier. The Queen, despite her own grief, seemed to sense the tension and moved with the diplomatic skill that had served her through decades of family crises. She approached Harry with the measured steps of a woman who understood that every gesture would be scrutinized and interpreted. Her embrace was warm but brief, acknowledging both her personal affection for her grandson and the complicated circumstances of his return. "Harry," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "Thank you for coming." The prince felt a lump form in his throat at the genuine warmth in his grandmother's words. Despite everything that had transpired, despite the interviews and the accusations, she remained the steady center around which the family orbited. Her ability to separate personal relationships from institutional responsibilities had always amazed him, and never more so than in this moment. Other family members began to approach Harry, each interaction carrying its own delicate balance of personal affection and public restraint. Princess, and always direct and practical, offered a firm handshake and a look that conveyed both sympathy for his loss and understanding of his difficult position. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie maintained polite distance while still acknowledging his presence with appropriate courtesy. But it was the interaction with his father, Prince Charles, that proved most emotionally complex. The Prince of Wales approached his youngest son with visible hesitation, unsure how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Their conversation was stilted and formal, touching on practical matters about the funeral arrangements rather than the deeper issues that had driven them apart. "The service will begin shortly," Charles said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your grandfather would have appreciated your being here." Harry nodded, unable to trust his voice to remain steady if he attempted more than basic acknowledgement. The man who had raised him after Diana's death seemed like a stranger now, and Harry could see in his father's eyes the same sense of loss and confusion that he felt himself. Throughout these careful exchanges, William remained by the window, apparently absorbed in watching the final preparations in the courtyard below. But Harry could tell from the set of his brother's shoulders and the way his hands clasped behind his back that William was acutely aware of every conversation taking place in the room. The Duke of Cambridge was facing his own internal struggle between the hurt he felt and the deep love for his brother that no amount of anger could completely erase. Catherine moved quietly through the room, serving as an unofficial diplomat between various family members. Her position was particularly delicate because she had maintained a close relationship with Harry before his departure, and now found herself trying to support her husband while not completely closing the door on future reconciliation. When she approached Harry, her greeting was warmer than some of the others, but still carefully measured. "It's good to see you, Harry," she said softly. "I know this is difficult for everyone." Her words carried multiple layers of meaning, acknowledging both the grief they all shared and the complicated dynamics that had brought them to this point. Harry appreciated her attempt to maintain some semblance of the warmth they had once shared, even as he understood that her primary loyalty had to be to her husband and their own family. As the time for the funeral service approached, a palisade quietly announced that it was time to process to the chapel. The family began to organize themselves according to the careful protocols that had been established for the ceremony. Harry found himself positioned several places behind William in the procession, a physical manifestation of the distance that had grown between them. The walk to the chapel took them through corridors lined with castle staff who had served Prince Philip for decades. Many of these people had watched Harry and William grow up, had seen them as mischievous boys racing through these same halls, and their faces reflected the sadness of witnessing the family's division alongside their grief for the Duke's passing. As they entered St. George's Chapel, the solemnity of the occasion seemed to push personal conflicts into the background, if only temporarily. The chapel held memories of happier times for both brothers. It was here that Harry had married Meghan just 3 years earlier, with William serving as his best man. Now they sat separated by their cousin Peter Phillips, a careful arrangement designed to minimize potential awkwardness while maintaining family unity for the cameras. The funeral service itself was a masterpiece of royal ceremony, honoring Prince Philip's naval career and his decades of public service. The Duke's coffin, draped in his personal standard and topped with his naval cap and sword, served as a powerful reminder of the man they had all lost. For both Harry and William, their grandfather had been more than just a senior member of the royal family. He had been a mentor, a source of strength, and often a mediator in family disputes. As the service progressed, both brothers found themselves lost in memories of their grandfather. They remembered his gruff humor, his unconventional wisdom, and his unwavering support during the darkest days following their mother's death. Prince Philip had understood the unique pressures they faced as young royals, and he had provided guidance that helped them navigate the impossible balance between public duty and personal happiness. During the moments of silence built into the ceremony, the chapel was filled with the weight of collective grief and remembrance. Harry found himself stealing glances at his brother, noting the familiar way William held himself when deeply moved, the slight tremor in his jaw that Harry recognized from their childhood. Despite everything that had happened between them, they were still brothers who had shared the most formative experiences of their lives. William, for his part, was struggling with his own complex emotions. The anger and hurt that had sustained him through the difficult months since Harry's departure seemed inadequate in the face of their shared loss. Their grandfather had always emphasized the importance of family unity, and William could almost hear Prince Philip's voice urging him to find a way past the current crisis. The hymns and prayers provided a soundtrack to their individual reflections, but they also served as a reminder of the traditions and values that had shaped their entire lives. The monarchy that had been both a burden and a privilege for their family was rooted in concepts of duty, service, and sacrifice, values that Prince Philip had embodied throughout his 99 years of life. As the service drew toward its conclusion, both brothers understood that this day represented more than just a farewell to their grandfather. It was potentially a turning point in their own relationship, a moment when grief might bridge the gap that anger and misunderstanding had created. The question that remained was whether they would have the courage and wisdom to seize that opportunity when it presented itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Prince Harry stepped out of the black Mercedes that had brought him from Frogmore Cottage. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his military medals on his dark suit jacket. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. This was the first time he had set foot on royal grounds since the explosive Oprah interview that had sent shockwaves through the monarchy just weeks earlier. Harry's eyes swept across the familiar stone walls and manicured gardens that had been the backdrop of his childhood. Every corner held memories of racing through these very paths with William, their grandfather's booming laughter echoing behind them as Prince Philip chased after his grandsons. Now, those same walls seemed to close in around him, heavy with the tension that had fractured his family. Inside the castle, Prince William was already going through his own emotional preparation. Standing before a mirror in one of the private chambers, he struggled with his tie, his fingers betraying the calm facade he had worked so hard to maintain in recent months. The Duke of Cambridge had barely slept the night before, his mind racing between grief for his grandfather and anxiety about seeing his brother face to face for the first time since Harry had left for California. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, watched her husband from across the room. She had seen William at his most vulnerable moments, but this morning carried a different weight. The man she married was not just mourning the loss of a beloved grandfather. He was grappling with the possibility of reconciliation with the brother who had been his closest companion for most of his life. "He'll be here soon," Catherine said softly, breaking the silence that had settled over the room like a thick blanket. William nodded without turning around. His reflection in the mirror showed eyes that carried the burden of future kingship alongside the pain of personal loss. "I know. I just don't know what to say to him." The brothers had not spoken privately since Harry's departure from royal duties over a year ago. Their last conversation had been brief and formal, conducted through intermediaries and carefully worded statements. The warmth that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing month. Down in the castle's lower corridors, staff members moved with practiced efficiency, but there was an underlying tension in their movements. Everyone understood the significance of this day beyond the funeral itself. The reunion of the two princes would be watched and analyzed by media around the world, but for those who had served the family for years, it represented something more personal. They had watched these boys grow up, had seen their bond strengthen after their mother's death, and had witnessed the gradual deterioration of that relationship with heavy hearts. Prince Philip himself had been deeply concerned about the rift between his grandsons in his final years. Palace insiders would later reveal that the Duke of Edinburgh had made several attempts to mediate between Harry and William, believing that their unity was essential not just for the family, but for the future of the monarchy itself. His death had come at a time when that reconciliation seemed more distant than ever. As Harry made his way through the castle's familiar corridors, he passed portraits of ancestors who had navigated their own family crises and public scandals. The weight of history seemed to press down on him with each step. He could hear the distant sounds of preparation for the funeral service, the same sounds that had accompanied countless royal ceremonies throughout his life. But this time, he was walking these halls as an outsider looking in. The prince had spent the flight from Los Angeles to London rehearsing potential conversations with his brother. He had imagined different scenarios, different words that might bridge the gap between them. But, as he drew closer to the inevitable encounter, those carefully prepared speeches seemed inadequate against the enormity of everything that had transpired between them. Meghan had wanted to come with him, to stand by his side during this difficult time, but her pregnancy and doctor's orders had kept her in California. Harry felt her absence acutely as he navigated the complex emotions of returning to a place that had once been home, but now felt foreign and unwelcoming. The support system he had built in his new life across the ocean seemed impossibly far away. In another part of the castle, other members of the royal family were dealing with their own complicated feelings about Harry's return. The Queen, despite her advanced age and her own grief, had made it clear that this day was about honoring Prince Philip's memory, not about family disputes. But the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore completely. Charles, the Prince of Wales, found himself caught between his two sons once again. His relationship with Harry had been strained even before the public revelations about family conversations and concerns about Archie's skin color. As the heir to the throne, Charles felt the weight of maintaining family unity while also protecting the institution that would one day be his responsibility to lead. The chapel where the funeral would take place was being prepared with military precision. Prince Philip's naval background would be honored with maritime traditions, and his coffin would be transported on a specially modified Land Rover that he had helped design himself. The ceremony would be limited in scope due to pandemic restrictions, but every detail had been carefully planned to reflect the Duke's wishes and his decades of service to the crown. As the morning progressed, the moment that everyone was anticipating and dreading in equal measure drew closer. The brothers would soon find themselves in the same space for the first time since their relationship had publicly fractured. The eyes of the world would be watching, but beneath the scrutiny lay a deeply personal story of two men who had once been inseparable, now struggling to find their way back to each other through grief and hurt. Harry paused outside the door that would lead him into the main gathering area where the family was assembling before the service. His hand rested on the ornate handle, and for a moment he closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather. Prince Philip had been a constant presence throughout his childhood, a figure who had bridged the gap between the old traditions of the monarchy and the modern world that Harry and William would inherit. The Duke of Edinburgh had understood the unique pressures that came with being born into the royal family, having married into it himself as an outsider. His advice and guidance had shaped both princes, teaching them about duty, service, and the importance of putting the institution before personal desires. Now, as Harry prepared to face his family and his brother, he wondered what his grandfather would have said about the choices he had made and the path that had led him to this moment. Taking a deep breath, Harry turned the handle and stepped forward into whatever awaited him on the other side of the door. The next few hours would determine not just how the family would say goodbye to Prince Philip, but whether two brothers could find a way to say hello to each other again after more than a year of silence and hurt.